The Paris Commune of 1871. I'd like to open with a quote by Frederick Engels, looking back on the events that happened. He said, "Well and good, gentlemen, do you want to know what this dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat." The Paris Commune of 1871 is held as the first assumption of power by the working class. For roughly 2 months, various socialists, including students, teachers, mill workers, and peasants, and virtually everyone in the middle to lower classes, form the most accurate example of what contemporary direct democracy looks like. From March 28th to May 28th, 71, the center of radical thought, Paris, the working class briefly held their ground against a bombardment of surrounding Prussian and French forces. Karl Marx, in retrospect, in his essay, The Civil War in France, said, "The Commune was formed of the municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at any point. The majority of its members were naturally workers or acknowledged representatives of the working class, and the Commune was to be working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time." But to set the correct political context for everything that was about to happen, the story really begins in July of 1870, where Parisians, right, people from Paris, grew quickly discontented with the French provisional government, with Napoleon III, who was actually the main Napoleon, Napoleon I, the guy that we know a lot about, initiated war with Prussian forces. Napoleon III, thinking Prussia would be weakened at the fear of civil war during its imperialist expansion, was crushed. Prussian troops squashed France's provisional army, and already by September, Paris was under siege. Now, this made the objective conditions right for the working class of Paris to take control. During the last few years, the rich became richer, and the poor became poorer. With the combination of embarrassing military failures, food shortages, and the majority of the French provisional government being in the monarchy's hands, the siege from Prussia was a push over the edge. The last straw that was broken was in January, after 4 months of the Prussian sieging Paris. It was when France surrendered and basically said that Prussia could go in and occupy Paris and take control of all of the governing and social organizations. And at this point, the Parisians weren't having it. Hundreds of thousands of citizens belonged to the militia, formerly called the National Guard. And these National Guardsmen elected their own officers and started appointing their own representatives to form a line of defense around Paris. And this is incredibly important because this was the beginning of radical and socialist organizing for what came to be known as the Paris Commune. In spite of the monarchist majority in the French provisional government, they took it one step further. They formed a formal governing and social body. And this is what came to be known as the Central Committee of the National Guard. It would provide elections and proper leadership defending against Prussian forces and a highly possible French restoration. The 92 delegates that consisted the Central Committee was made up of professional doctors, journalists, and political activists. Assuming the authority of all public services, this all happened within a 60-day time span, they passed the following decrees. The first was the separation of church and state. Second was the remission of rents owed for the entire period of the siege, during which payment had been suspended. The abolition of night work in the hundreds of Paris bakeries. The granting of pensions to the unmarried companions and children of National Guards killed on active service. The free return by the city pawn shops of all working men's tools and household items valued up to 20 francs, pledged during the siege. The Commune was concerned that the skilled workers had been forced upon their tools during the war, to survive. the postponement of commercial debts, debt obligations, and abolition of interest on the debts, and lastly, the right of employees to take over and run an enterprise if it was deserted by its owner. The Commune, nonetheless, recognized the previous owner's right to compensation. It's important to note, during this time, churches were not allowed to teach in schools. Education was set up to be almost entirely secular and virtually free. Churches were allowed to practice only at the price of allowing their church houses to become public political meeting houses. And at this time, other social movements came into play with feminism, notably, and I'm going to slaughter this name, Nathalie Glimel and Elizabeth Dimitrieff, formed what they called the Women's Unions for Defense of Paris and Care of the Injured. The union believed that their fight against unjust patriarchy was innately a class struggle, a fight against global capitalism which defined them as subordinates in society. They called for the replacement of legal prostitution for free and professional education for all women, and they called for equality in the workplace and the right to divorce from their partners. Aside from this pursuit of these higher justices, as Lenin later put it, the formation of military defense was taken when the National Guard, along with women and children of the Commune, claimed cannon was seated in Paris from the French provisional government. They claimed the cannon on the banner that they paid for them through taxes and through public subscription. So with 400 guns at their disposal, they made for the north and the east part, actually, that's reverse, so the north and the east part of Paris to defend against Prussia. Of course, Prussia's up here and they're coming down, and that's where the siege was going on. So later on April 2nd, not even after a week after the Central Committee was formed, skirmishes with the French government commenced near Versailles, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is just southwest of Paris. While holding off Prussian forces from the east remained fairly stable, French troops from Versailles marched on Paris from the west. And this is, of course, a huge stab at the Commune, because later Marxists and anarchists and socialists of all kinds later looked back and they were like, why didn't you go and topple Versailles? Versailles was the hotspot for French forces. Okay. French troops were trained in street fighting. They blew holes in houses and tunneled their way into Paris and easily broke past the Communards' defense on the west side. So to paint an image, you have the entire east side, which has Prussian forces in the west side. Yeah, is that west for you guys? Yeah, you have, right, Versailles coming up, and they went straight past all the cannon that wasn't there and broke into the houses, blew holes in them, tunneled their way. That's how they broke in. And this is where everything started to fail and fall. Local authorities that developed the electoral organizing were in very little conjunction with the other districts around the city. And power was completely decentralized. There was no mediator of these separate districts and these separate authorities. Once one district was taken over, the rest spilled over in defeat because they could only pay attention to their own survival. And the last week of the Paris Commune, after communards had been slaughtered, literally, is known as La Semaine Sanglante, or the Bloody Week. And executions by the invading French government commenced. The last feudal stances from the communards trickled from May 27th, and finally the city fell on the evening of the 28th of May. An estimated 40,000 communards started the endless march to Versailles for trial and execution. and between Marx and Engels' analysis and contemporary professors, like I stated earlier, the death toll clocked in anywhere between 10 and 50,000. The figures are different according to different sources. I think Marx, I believe it was Marx, said that it rested on 20,000, roughly. So yeah, the first establishment of the very first commune of the workers, by and for the workers, had fallen. Now, my criticism has been epitomized by Lenin, who basically reiterated what Marx and Engels set forth after the commune fell, especially in the split between the First International. And my criticism is based on the French military structure as a key weakness of the fall, which is decentralized districts, and they just got destroyed. Here Lenin says, but two mistakes destroyed the fruits of their splendid victory. The proletariat stopped halfway. Instead of setting about expropriating the expropriators, it allowed itself to be led astray by dreams of establishing higher justice in the country, united by a common national task. Such institutions, such as the banks, for example, were not taken over. The Proudhonist theories about a just exchange, etc., still prevailed among the socialists. The second mistake was excessive magnanimity and on the part of the proletariat. Instead of destroying its enemies, it sought to exert moral influence on them. It underestimated the significance of direct military operations in civil war, and instead of launching a resolute offensive against Versailles, and Marx made that comes from Marx, that would have crowned its victory in Paris, it tarried and gave the Versailles government time to gather the dark forces and prepare for the blood-soaked week of May. And Marx, the last phrase that he says on his essay, The Civil War in France, he says, its martyrs are enshrined in the great heart of the working class. And I'd like to close by saying it's up to us to redeem them. Okay, I'll try and answer questions as much as I can. I would love to hear an anarchist perspective on the commune. I know that Bakunin and Kropotkin, and I think later, Goldman wrote about it, but does anybody have any feedback on, from an anarchist perspective on the commune?
I don't.
Okay. Well, we'll have to talk about that later then. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Well, it seemed that Marx and Lenin both had criticism about why it failed. What do you think the chances of success would have been had they followed those directives? Had they, for instance, done, as they suggest, like appropriating banks and etc.?
I think the outcome would have been drastically different. I didn't cover a notable revolutionary. His name was Louis Blanqui, and he's one of the most important revolutionary figures through the European revolutions of 1848, and he was imprisoned by I think in Versailles. And I don't have that source. I believe his idea was to set up a dictatorship and overthrow the bourgeois, and that was kind of the ends in and of themselves. Establish a dictatorship, overthrow the bourgeois. That was it. Maybe if there was some better, obviously some centralized organizing, and they did take the banks, I think things would have been drastically different. In my opinion, the communards were way too nice. And like Lenin said, they were just like, yeah, just here, have some money. We don't care about your debts. And they were slaughtered. like the figures were stated, it was like 10 to 50,000. That's a ton of people that gets absolutely slaughtered. So, yeah, I think if they were to take the banks and the organization were different, I feel like that's what begs the entire split between anarchists and Marxists, was those two issues.
Well, you can answer this if you want, perhaps we can just open up for discussion, but one of the significant factors of the first French Revolution in 1789 was terror. Right? You have massive amounts of terror going on to defend the Republic. You're constantly executing counter-revolutionaries, maybe some people will witness it, but lots of bloodshed. And you have the king being destroyed completely and utterly. You have people, again, law of the maximum, where you sell grain above a certain price, you get executed, no ifs, ands, or buts. So do you think that terror was present during this Paris Commune?
I think.
And if so, do you think, if it was absent, do you think it was it should have been a necessary condition for a possible victory?
I can't give that an answer from my perspective, because I don't have a position on that yet, at least. But I know the Jacobins, who took huge pride, in the French Revolution, they were in I think in the Northeast District. And it's interesting to note that the Northeast District was the last to be overthrown by French forces. That's significant. So, but again, it goes back to they were all separate districts, completely out of conjunction with each other, and they got slaughtered. Tragedy.
Well, okay. With regard to revolutionary terror, I mean, based on what we've just heard, the Commune wasn't defeated by necessarily counter-revolutionaries or people trying to restore capitalism within the Commune. It was destroyed by a military force that came in and wiped them out. Like, I'm sympathetic to criticisms that say they should have marched on Versailles. They should have not been nice to the banks. They should have just they should have just been all right, that's it, we're doing it.
Yeah.
That's great, but I mean, as far I don't see that the revolutionary terror is a necessary condition for defending them against the French army.
If I may, Marx, and this is in the Civil War of France, which I can send you the link, and it should be read by everybody here. He said the communards should have dealt more harshly with counter-revolutionaries, and I feel like that kind of implies maybe what Chris is saying about revolutionary terror.
Man, give a response real quick.
No,
Well, I mean, this is the thing, right? If they had lined up all the bankers, right, and executed them, you probably would have some really less amounts of bankers coming back to reclaim most of their property, it seems to me at least. You can make a lot of people dead, and they can't necessarily exercise counter-revolution against you.
Two things. One is, at this time, wasn't Napoleon III in the custody of the Prussians because his army had been captured?
Yes.
And so wasn't the entire governing of France basically governed out of a weak coalition from Versailles?
Yeah, that's correct.
I
believe the commander was Thiers.
Thiers.
Yeah, he was the next in line of command, but continue.
And so at the very outbreak of the Paris Commune, they very easily could have marched on Versailles and put the weak provisional government under, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. But at the same time, I believe there were 6 main heads of the council with 92 delegates. These 6 were the main, and they were actually executed later. I'm sympathetic to them because, I mean, they're setting up a system that had never been implemented before, at least not to my knowledge. And I mean, they had to do not just the legislation. They didn't just have to handle the legislative powers. They also had to do the executive. I mean, and like I said, I think it was 6 days they were already under attack. They should have done it as soon as they could. And that goes to kind of the overlying criticism of course, Marxist-Leninists would say that's why Lenin danced in the snow when USSR lasted longer than 2 months.
Also, I mean, weren't there strong elements of counter-revolution? From what I understand, weren't bankers and the rich in Paris feeding information to the French troops?
Yes, but they weren't the main contributors to a lot of counter-revolution. It was actually a political activist who was spying and who was getting paid for it by Versailles, and he headed, or he was part of the council committee of the National Guard, and he basically gave Versailles all of the information. I think according to some of my sources, there were some counter-revolutionaries, but in my opinion, it wasn't all not dealing with counter-revolutionaries in a correct manner. It was, they weren't organized. And of course, different districts should also be looked at differently and according to what happened when, I think. Because there was a certain district that had more banks, just geographically wise. That should have been considered. So, does anybody have any more questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Now, Chris Manor is going to talk about locking herself.